Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our morning conversations. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your divine presence, to guide us in everything we do, that instead of merely passing time, we actually expand our consciousness. And as the incarnation flows away, we find ourselves ever closer to Thee. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. I've mentioned in different talks that I've given the sort of strange, I want to call it edge of madness, thoughts that come into my mind and have come into my mind for many years, which is an almost panic reaction to the inescapability of consciousness. It's not a panic reaction anymore, but it's like a karmic memory. Um, when I lived for my first 10 years at Ananda, I lived with a small group of women. We were all brahmacharinis, and in the context of Ananda, we had our own little area of the community on the land piece that's called Ayodhya, which is where Swami Kriyananda has the Crystal Hermitage now. It's where he lived. We were sort of an upper Ayodhya. There's a whole cloister building with several small apartments. It's all very attractive now. When we were there, it was all very attractive when we were there, but it was just little tiny trailers, I believe. I don't think there were any buildings except for that we built a bathhouse. And we had a temple that was a teepee. It was a very nice canvas teepee. No one lived in it, but we meditated in there every morning, pretty much every morning, and at other times also. And it was the same group of women, like the core group was about 8. It swelled and shrank over the course of 10 years, but there was a core of us who, to this day, even though we're dispersed around the world, and most of those who were brahmacharini subsequently got married, not all, but most. But every morning we'd come together and meditate, and there was such a feeling of unity among us. This is what I want to say, because we lived a very isolated life, and we were just very tied to each other on extremely deep levels. I guess what I'm also saying is that even today, with that nucleus of women, there's a bond that's quite different than what I have with anyone else. And God knows there's a lot of people at Ananda with whom I feel very close, but I can see those women, and we have this circle of light that holds us from all those years of life together. And I used to marvel, and I was only half joking, that we would go into that temple, we would meditate together. We would usually recite the poem Samadhi at the end of our meditation. We would chant. And I would say, how? Well, I'm going to first tell this little funny joke before I say this. Dr. Peter told this joke once in, I don't know the context, probably Sunday service. He likes to tell jokes. There were 3 old codgers, so to speak, sitting on the porch of the rest home, and they were rocking in the rocking chair, and they were talking to each other about, what do you think the greatest invention of our times is? And one of them says, oh, I think it's electricity. You can just turn on a switch and you've got lights. The other one says, well, electricity, that's nothing. What about the airplane? I mean, it just flies through the air and goes wherever it wants to. The third guy says, you guys are not thinking at all. He said, I think the greatest invention of our time is the thermos. And they say, the thermos, what are you talking about? He said, look, if you put it in hot, it stays hot. If you put it in cold, it stays cold. I ask you, how does it know? So I would always think when we go into the temple, and I would feel our consciousness literally, we sort of would just merge like this, but then everybody would take home the right one. And I would often think, how does it know? How does it know where it belongs and who it should go home with? And why don't I go home as somebody else? Now, I recognize, and I'm the first to admit, that those are the kinds of thoughts that cause you to have mental breakdowns. So I would never follow those thoughts because I think in previous incarnations I have followed those thoughts. Swamiji said when a friend of mine who was involved in the spiritual path had a break from reality, which these things happen. And I said that I felt it was a clear attempt to escape from the overwhelming possibility of the necessity for God realization. It was like the person had come right up onto the brink and could see in front of them what was going to be asked of them and just decided, I don't want to do it. I mean, it was temporary. In fact, it was quite short term. Person came back and has been extremely stable since then. Swami agreed with me. Not by any means in all cases is it a metaphysical crisis when someone has a break with reality, but in that case it was. And here's what was so interesting to me. Swami said madness is a stage on the spiritual path. And I don't know whether he said everyone goes through it, but he said it's extremely common. And I think it's been, everybody has a history. I think it's my history because all my energy is in my mind. So if there was going to be a break, that would be where it would be. I'm not there anymore, but I can feel the attractiveness of it. That's how I want to put it. Now, this is not going to be a long, true confessions. That's not really the point. But that perception is an existential issue that I think all of us have to come to sooner or later. And in fact, the entire cycle from delusion to God realization is looking for an alternative. My father was a Virgo, and he was very exact about things. And when I read somewhere, I don't know whether it was Swami Kriyananda's book or another astrological book, just talking about how the Virgo will search, just search the whole wall for the little opening that they can get through. Not that they're trying to avoid things, but they're very conscientious about looking for the place. And my father would always take every idea and he would break it down. It would annoy me because I would just want to make sweeping generalizations, and he would insist on us breaking it down to its component parts. Of course, I'm a lot like that now myself, so I think I appreciate it. But there's this other part which is much more, infinitely more compelling, which is, we are here, and ultimately there's no end to this experience except God realization. Death is not an end to anything. And by this experience, I mean the inescapability of our individual consciousness. When I was younger, when I was a child, before I came to the spiritual path and a teenager, I came in my late teens, so I didn't have that much life. But I always wanted to be happy. That was how I put it to myself. In many ways, it was almost the reverse. I always wanted to avoid suffering, even though I didn't suffer. I had a perfectly beautiful upbringing. I had a perfectly beautiful life, for that matter. When I spoke to Swami about this incredible urge to be happy and to avoid suffering, even though my life was perfectly fine, well, he just pointed out to me past lives. And of course, that's where it comes from. It comes from this long accumulated experience where we keep trying and it keeps turning out as it turns out. Something happens, and the perfect fulfillment that we thought was just at the edge where we're just about to get it, something turns it. So when I was younger, I had this urge to be happy, and it was all the urge was extremely clear and extremely powerful, but the concepts I would put around it were very confusing. And the one sort of integrous pursuit in life that I thought was there was to raise children. I was fond of children. I was a camp counselor. I did creative dramatics with children. I just assumed I'd be a mother and a school teacher. I mean, life turns out different than we expect. Not better, actually, but because that was the only picture I could see. I would work with children because it seemed like an opportunity to do good without the corrupting influence of so many other forces. But really, almost, well, pretty much exactly the day I met Swami, yes, the day I met Swami and realized that Ananda was a possibility for me, especially the desire for motherhood, just was erased. And it wasn't erased because I don't have an inclination toward babies and children. I still do. But I had a realization of what I was actually looking for and what was actually making me suffer. And what was making me suffer was the inescapability of my own consciousness and the incredible limitation of being just one individual with this whole, baggage of past life memory and self-definition and gender and culture. And, look at it. Write down, who am I? And just you start writing this long list. Yes, you can say I am one with the infinite spirit and, and all that I've had in the past and all that I anticipate in the future. It just goes on and on and on. And there's no escape except forward. There's no escape except an honest, just completely fearless, unbiased look at what's holding me back, meaning what delusions do I cling to? What self definitions do I cling to that cause me to just loop continuously in relationship to this egoic self? And what practices can I do that will break that? And I have my father's Virgo in me more than I may know. I look for the loopholes. I mean, actually, I know there aren't any. So it's a little different the way I look now. When I remember when I was about 18, conceivably 19, when I first really learned about self-realization, and I had the past life realization. The moment I was introduced to Sanatan Dharma through a book by Vivekananda, I don't remember learning it. I just recognized it. I don't remember learning to read. I always knew how to read. I don't even, it just, there was no learning curve. It was just books were there. Everybody in my family was reading them. I was reading them. There was no space long before I went to school. I don't remember learning anything in school, but when I found Vivekananda, I just recognized it. Oh yes, this is it. It's like the opposite of neti neti, which means not this, not this. It's like, oh yes, this is it. And I recall lying in bed, and my recollection of it is that I was awake all night, but one doesn't really know exactly. But I was certainly preoccupied all night, awake or asleep. And I was looking for the loophole. I was looking to ask myself if there was any alternative to transforming my consciousness, because I sensed even then this is not going to be easy. And so I wanted to know if I had to do it. And I remember, just lying there in the dark, but using my imagination, I projected myself forward and backward in time, imagining, future science fiction kind of universes. I projected myself backwards into um, horse and carriage eras and earlier than that. I projected myself to every country that I could imagine. I'd never been outside the US, but I projected myself to every country I could think of, every age I could imagine. And several things happened. Wherever I went, I was there. And, that's the folly, they say, of travel, is no matter how far you go, you take yourself with you. I could not figure out how to get outside of my own consciousness. And then I would always die. And I remember thinking, very vividly about my deathbed, which I'd never seen anybody die or been with anybody who died. But of course, we've died bazillions of times. So I knew what it was. And the projection in that early year was pretty much exactly what I've seen since then. Just everything that I would try to use to buttress my sense of security and well being, the people who loved me, at that point, I thought all the children that I was going to raise, everything, I could just get the huge picture. But in the end, at the center of no matter how big the picture was, how exotic the country, the time, the place, at the end, there was one little body with one little tiny consciousness in it, and that was going to be me. And I couldn't erase it. And so whatever its vibration was, that would be me. And it panicked me. It both liberated me and panicked me. It still does, I have to say, although the panic is waning. It's liberating because there is an answer. There is an answer, and the answer is we can change our consciousness, and by the grace of God, we can actually liberate ourselves from limitation. When I discovered Ananda, I realized that what was causing me anguish was the sense of entrapped limitation, which I've come to understand is ego identification. The I that is truly I is Jesus. Is like Jesus said, "I and my Father are one." The true I is infinite. The true I is Sat Chit Ananda, ever existing, ever conscious. That was the rub for me. Ever conscious bliss. Ever existing, it doesn't die. It never loses awareness. But the comfort in it all is that ever existing awareness is one of ever new joy. So that's the way out. And anything less than that, we're still entrapped. And insofar as we suffer from that entrapment, which people, you don't have to have a big philosophical understanding of any of this. We sit within ourselves and we feel. Feeling is fundamental to our nature. That every sentient being feels. If you even a worm, as Swami often says, if you stick it with something sharp, which is kind of a mean thing to do. But if you stick it with something sharp or even touch it, it tries to get away. It feels it. And it feels it, it evaluates the feeling and responds to it. And just at the level of a worm, it will do that. Somewhere in my life, I've been around snails. It's probably in some garden that I had. And the thing about a snail is he has this curly little thing like this that goes out, and you can touch that. You can touch the end of it. I mean, I'm not really very fond of slimy things, but I remember doing that. You touch that and he pulls it back. That's been my sort of experiment. It's like you don't have a brain. You don't read. You don't have much of a life. But if I touch you, you feel it. Because we always feel. And how we feel, really much more than what we think or anything like that, is really who we are, because feeling perfect bliss, anything less than perfect bliss, as I was starting to say, you don't have to have a construct for it. We can recognize pleasure and pain. Everybody can recognize pleasure and pain, just like that. And we have an instinctive, uncontrollable desire to shrink away from pain and to go toward pleasure. Now, our tastes can become quite distorted as human beings. So, what people think is pleasurable, what people call painful, varies widely from individual to individual. But nonetheless, each is responding to that pleasure pain response. So, and it can only be said after a certain number of lifetimes. And that number is, the scriptures, the Indian scriptures, it's impossibly huge. You'll go to a psychic and she'll say, "Oh, you're an old soul. You've had 150 lifetimes." 150 doesn't even make a dent. One of the images of how many lifetimes it takes, once you reach the human level, is this vast lake that you can't even see across. And I'm going to say, I believe it says once every 5,000 years, but that's just so depressing. But infrequently, some bird comes and takes a beakful of water out of that lake and goes and dumps it somewhere else. As long as it takes that bird to empty the lake, is how many lifetimes we've been just tossing around out here. So by the time it crosses our minds that we have to look at this differently, someone, I think it may have been Master, who said, if all of your incarnations were a 24-hour clock, by the time you become deeply committed to self-realization, you're in the last few seconds of that clock, proportionally. But we're still in them. And there's just still this existential necessity to face into what we're working with. And it's complicated because we also have to be both absolutely grand in our aspirations, and we have to hold in our hearts, I have to hold in my heart, this absolute belief that if it isn't the happy ending, it's not the ending yet. So no matter what happens, this is not the end. The only possible end is perfect bliss. So I'll know when the story is over, and until then, we're just going to turn the page for another chapter. No matter how horrific it may be, no matter how exalted it may be, whatever it is, it's not over till, as Master said, we achieve endlessness, endlessness in bliss. And so every day, so let me just find my thought again for a moment. There has to be a complete relaxation into that. I used the word panic, and I talked about, I still have to sort of pull back from the edge of too much examination of this, because it can unsettle me. But even if it's unsettled, what choice do we have? When Swami has been asked on multiple occasions, what is the secret? What are the requirements for success on the spiritual path? However he uses, whatever words he uses, this is what it is. When you absolutely realize you have no choice, that all other choices are unacceptable. What I said first is correct. We have no choice. We are on the train, and the train is heading for God realization, and we get to move around in the cars, but we cannot get off the train. And so whatever we do, if I can curl up under the seat and just refuse to come out, but it won't make any difference. That is part of my journey. But I can speed the process and make it far more enjoyable if I don't resist. And we can't resist anything. Everything that comes to us has to be a question of, what am I supposed to learn here? And everything that happens has to be a disciplined effort on our part not to resist what we're supposed to learn. And it's just not that easy. Spiritual community it's impossible to express strongly enough how important satsang is. Satsang meaning good company. Satsang means actually keeping the company of truth. But what it has come to mean is keeping the company of other truth seekers. And now, because of these online capabilities, in-person contact is better. We would be lying to ourselves to say otherwise. But online contact is a great deal. It's a great deal. But we need friends. We need people who know us. And we need to reach out in open expectation to those whose vibration attracts us, whether in person, online, through letters, because we need to see ourselves reflected back in the mirror of other people's experiences. Our own involvement with ourselves is so intense. Just yesterday, or conceivably the day before, I've been with Ananda for 45 years. I've had 50 years, I mean. Now, I've had I've had lots of experiences with lots of people, and I have a lot of very close friends. But I have to say it out loud. A lot of friendships at Ananda are hard won, meaning we work out karma together. I mean, there's some friendships that are effortless. You just recognize a soul companion with whom you have worked out all difficulties, all disharmonies. Although sometimes they surprise you. I've been surprised recently about fractures in friendships I didn't know were possible, and yet look at that, there they are. But we're so involved in our own awareness that we just don't see ourselves as others see us, and it just takes time. And then sometimes the seed is planted, and it's a decade, 20 years. Just recently, yesterday, situation is far too complicated, but to explain, and it's not even relevant. But I had a persistent disharmony with a group of people for years. And I don't know, yesterday it was like, oh my God, that's how I appeared. I saw it from the inside. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, that's what it looked like. And it was, oh, of course, that's the response I got. What would I expect? I was with Swamiji once, and he wanted to present a certain idea to someone. And it was an unpopular idea, and he had me phone the person and suggest the idea. It was a setup because I knew they wouldn't listen to me. So I called up and I suggested it. And even though it was even Swami's idea, they didn't want to hear anything from me. I'm very strong, too strong, and sometimes I'm insensitive, have been insensitive. People just don't say anything to me, girl. So I presented it and it was rejected. I mean, Swami was sitting there. And afterwards he said, how did it go? And I said, well, not very well, sir. I said, they're not very open to anything I say. He said, are you critical of them? And I said, all the time, sir. And he just shrugged his shoulders and like, what did you expect? Do you think if you put out energy that's not receptive and open, other people will be receptive and open to you? I mean, I guess, what is the phrase? Duh, like that. But it's fascinating to me how self-evident it is when you see it, and how completely what a black wall it is until you do. This is the process. I mean, it's just, we need each other. We have to love each other because we need to be loved. And we all need help along the way. And here we are. And I'm talking about my spiritual family. I'm talking about the globe. Everybody has a story. And sometimes, and I've said this, and I can, sometimes stern measures are required. It's not always that we just say, oh, well, that's just the way he is, and we let him rampage on and cause untold misery. Sometimes he or she has to be stopped. But that doesn't mean we give up on compassion. In fact, sometimes when we stop someone fiercely, there's more compassion in it because it's all about who we are. We must reach the point of perfect love, perfect bliss, perfect wisdom. I mean, that's who we are. We're on the train. We really can't get off. And so every day, it's the same trial. Every day, it's as Master put it, and he put it beautifully. We have to fight the battle for joy right where we're standing. And then he said, take care of the minutes, and the incarnations will take care of themselves. Now that's a project I can do. That's how I keep myself sane. Well, I don't know about infinity, but I can deal with this morning and do my best. And then when that's done, I'll think about the afternoon. And in that way, Master promises incarnations will take care of themselves. We are profoundly blessed. to have been brought even to the slightest awareness of the power of presence of God in our lives and the freedom and the joy that that promises. God bless you.